to the Boundaries and Beyond podcast with Jennifer, Dr. P, and Trinity here, who's wearing her fuzzy little hoodie. She's falling asleep right now. I also want to remind everyone, please share with all those people who could learn about boundaries that you know of. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to be notified whenever we put out a new podcast.
If you haven't joined us before, this is a conversation format, and we are talking about relationships. We've been married for almost 30 years. When you lose track of the years, you've been married for a long time. And no, we did not get married that young either, so that makes us very old. And we are discussing currently topics around dynamics, relationship dynamics. Some of it may seem a little bit foreign, and may even seem topics about psychology. Today, we are going to be discussing some of that. And it might seem what some people call medicinal, as in it's hard to swallow. But we are trying to make it a little bit more laid back and conversation style so people can relate. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave some comments. And what is the episode about today?
So today is our 5th episode, and we will be going into family of origin. Family of origin is basically the foundation of who we are. You've all heard about nature versus nurture. So this is the nurture side of who we are. Our families basically built that structure as we were growing up. Now, Dr. P and I have a style where we like to be very open about our own personal journey. This takes us kind of into the weeds of areas where it could be very triggering. We both have had very dysfunctional bringings, but it could be very triggering to our own loved ones. So we're going to be very careful here as to what we do disclose, and we'll generalize more, if that makes sense, because we certainly don't want to hurt those people that especially as Christmas and Thanksgiving are coming up, we don't want to add any fodder to the
Drama,
exactly. Not that we have drama during those days, but yeah, we want to keep that non-triggering, in other words.
And on that note, I would say for our viewers, we are not exactly, our conversations are not scripted. We do keep to a topic, but we're not scripted. So we got to be careful not to let things out that we're not supposed to be saying. And that's part of boundary systems. So you'll hear us say a lot of that. We don't have permission to talk about our deep traumatic issues going back to childhood. So we keep it very general, but yes, we actually had to do quite a bit of therapy, both individually, each of us individually, and as a couple. And that's where the relational aspects comes from. As we've mentioned in other episodes, we were that Enneagram that you talk about, and I don't know the Enneagram, but you do. But the thing behind that is that we were meant to be a very chaotic relationship based on an Enneagram. And what was it again? I'm an 8 and you're a 2, or what?
No. Well, recently in the last few years, it's odd, but for years I was always a 4. The artist, the creative, the open personality type, and kind of the free spirit hippie, if you will. And you were the 8, the boss, the driver, the no nonsense.
Rigid.
Yeah, rigid, very general, like militant in some ways. Structured, very, very structured. So it's almost the opposite. Interestingly, describe the Enneagram, if you get really deep into it, and I got this really thick several page report on, how we would interact as a couple. And basically all the other, combinations, it had nice little things to say, but it was like, oh, this would be a very volatile relationship. Interestingly enough, I now tend to, even when I'm trying to score as a 4, I get an 8. I don't know what's up with that.
So that's interesting. I've never taken that.
Yeah.
So am I still an 8 based on?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm still an 8
Yeah.
according to my wife.
Yes.
And I don't even know what all those numbers mean because all I know is that I'm an 8.
It's fun. If anybody's ever had a chance to, if you haven't heard of the Enneagram, there's a book. It's a short, easy read, and then you can take a test as to what kind of personality. It starts with an E-E-N.
I think it
Okay.
is what it is.
Okay. Good.
The one thing about that is I don't know the science behind it, if it's reliable science.
Your sister said that it.
My sister, who's a clinical psychologist.
Yeah, she said that it was useful. Some people considered it kind of old school. Other people still use it to this day. So I
So
think,
it is used in clinical settings.
Yeah, it's depending on, I guess, what philosophy you come out of.
So what school of psychology you come
Yeah.
from. What I will say, though, regardless whether or not that is a reliable diagnostic tool, we were certainly chaotic
Yeah,
before we started
it
to...
nailed us.
Yeah, it did have us pretty... I mean, we were on the verge of destroying our relationship. So we had to both be motivated to repair our relationship, and you had to be learn to be structured, and I had to learn to be more flexible.
Which it just goes to show you can't, there's this philosophy out there that you can't change your personality, that I'm living proof. You can change, you're living proof of that.
So one of the things, part of the problem with that is a lot of the academic research suggests one thing or another, but you're looking at statistics. But the ones that understood that better are people in the recovery field. For example, alcoholics. They don't change. They don't stop drinking until they hit their proverbial rock bottom. When people hit that proverbial rock bottom, that's when they are willing to change. The problem is that there's a lot of people that never hit that rock bottom, and that's the problem. But can we change? Yes. And in the Christian counseling field, it is understood that God and miracles do occur. And to me, I know I was talking one time to a more academic person more in the scientific field and what are known as the hard sciences, and essentially saying there's no such thing as a miracle, right? I'm making all the logical and scientific arguments against the miracle. And I said, well, you know what? If you turned around and believe in God yet tomorrow, I would consider that a miracle. And actually, he could not argue with that.
Yeah.
At the same time, to me, somebody who turns away from drinking, to me, that's a miracle, regardless of how likely or unlikely they are to do that. So anyway, let's move on to our topic. Family. Why are we talking about family of origin? What's that got to do with our relationships? And we're talking about the Enneagram and different styles. This concept of family of origin, and the way we're going to present it is a variation on attachment theory. We're not going to go into the weeds of attachment theory. We're not going to go into all the attachment styles. We're actually going to leave it at 2 attachment styles. And then if anybody wants to pursue that even further, go deeper, that's up to them. But this is meant for us as lay people. In a relationship, I'm not going to pull out my book and argue with you which attachment style you have. We just both need to understand that how we're going to mesh, or we're going to respond to our personalities, and take it from there. If we need more help, we need to go to our therapist. And that's always been the thing. You learn enough so you can manage it. And then when you get into roadblocks, then you go to your counselor, your therapist, or another couple. And that was the purpose of our recovery group, the Recovering Couples Anonymous, that we worked with. A lot of the other couples were running into roadblocks, and we often, as a group, not us personally, but the group, would help them get through those roadblocks. And it's not just the couple themselves, as families, etc. So one of the things we're talking about, you mentioned, we don't want to create, with the holidays coming up, where Thanksgiving is next week, we don't want to create more trouble and then have a bad holiday. But that's just it. You don't want to bring this up in a family setting where everybody's just trying to relate and
Be
and
relational.
find peace. Yeah, essentially
Enjoy each
find
other.
peace. That's if you really need to bring up some hard stuff, this is not the time to do it. You have to do it in private and separately and at the right time.
And probably with guidance.
Yeah, not in the middle of everybody's calling the turkey and you bring up,
Yeah.
you just start trauma dumping,
Yeah.
as they call it these days.
That's a container boundary.
Yes, so you contain yourself so that you don't spill that drama in the middle of a family gathering.
Yeah.
So that there's a time and place for that, and that is not the Thanksgiving table. Okay. Having said that, sometimes during those family meetings is if somebody's had a hard time recently, there's been, for example, somebody's ill or there's been a death in this family, that's a good time to be comforted, right? And that is really what you're looking for. That's what we're looking for in the family gatherings is just the comfort from living.
Yeah.
Life is hard. I don't care who you are. If you think life is not hard, then we should probably ask the people around you if life is hard, because that means that they're having a harder time than you are, or at least with you. So that's just something to consider. Okay. So let's talk about the family of origin. We're gonna leave it very simple. This is not, I say simple, but this is not exactly simple. So here on this chart, you're gonna see at the top the three major roles that we play as children. And this is when we're talking about childhood roles in the family of origin, we are talking about you yourself, what kind of role you played with your parents.
Within the family.
But it's mostly how you related to your parents, because it can be...
Well, and siblings.
Hold on. No, because this actually relates to what role you played. For example, hero child to dad and hero child to mom, or you can play hero child to dad or scapegoat to mom. So that's how this goes. So you're looking at the pattern of behavior. Remember, if we're talking about attachment styles, you're going to play a role in different situations. And you may play a different role over time. And I will go into some of those in a minute. So keep in mind that these can shift. They're not rigid. And if you have more than one caregiver, so for example, I spent a good portion of my childhood living with my grandparents. So I had a different role to play with them than I did with my mother and my father. So that's why that's important. And sometimes, especially if one of the parents dies, then there is... Now that becomes, let me just, since I brought that up, the lost child. Okay, I put the lost child and then the loner. That's another variation of the role, but it's pretty limited. The lost child would be if one of your parents died, you automatically lost child to that parent that passed away. Essentially, you're lost. It's gone. It's abandoned. That parent abandoned you, not on purpose, but abandoned. Your father passed away. What would you say?
That was the most devastating thing I have ever experienced, was my father passing away. I can't speak for, those people that their fathers just up and left. I guess that would leave a hole of constantly grasping for where is that person, trying to find them, and that would... Whereas my father died and that was final.
And I think that's my point, is you get closure.
Yeah.
But if your parent is disappeared, because I had that issue, so to speak, but my mother was gone from my life for a while, so that was actually very unsettling. And even though I didn't lose a parent during that time, I almost felt like I did. So it is important to keep it, to understand how that affects us. So yes, the pain of losing a parent in that manner, death in the family, can be very severe. Sometimes the trauma that comes in other words, the psychological, when I say trauma, I'm talking about the psychological effect that an absentee parent has. They could be alive, but married somebody else and moved away to another continent, but they're still there. They're there. That can be very unsettling to a child.
Yeah.
So, and it's because you didn't exactly say closure, but you alluded to that, I think. Did you say closure? Or am I?
I'm not sure that it was just final. I wouldn't
final.
use the word closure because it was like almost I died, if that makes sense. It was such a dark hole, and it was so overwhelming. I don't know if closure is the right word. I've never liked that word.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the list here. And you see why we don't want to get too deep into this, because this can be some people listening can get very upset over this discussion. So if this is upsetting you, just press pause or come back another day, whichever works for you.
And we don't mean to trump one over the other either.
Right.
It's you're not saying that your experience was worse than mine.
No.
Mine was worse than yours, because to me as a child it was devastating. As I know for you, it was devastating. So we're not trying to So basically, we're not trying to one-up each other. Everybody's experience is different. For me, could have been absolutely devastating. For another person, maybe it wasn't either. Other people, I mean, the things that we've been through have caused people to do horrible, harmful things to themselves and others. So we don't ever want to minimize another person's experience or one up another person's experience.
So basically the point is that your experience is your experience, and the question is, how is it affecting you now, and how is it affecting your relationship?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to sit with your spouse and compare notes or keep scores.
Mine was worse than yours.
Yeah, no, don't get into that.
Yeah.
That never ends well. No. Okay, so let's go back to talking about. So the lost child is probably the simplest one to understand in terms of just grasping the concept. Is by no means a simple situation. But often the lost child, because the thing that a child is most in fear is being abandoned, right? Because being abandoned is a life-threatening situation for a child. Mm-hmm. So the lost child does carry quite a bit of pain. And that can be quite severe growing up, okay, regardless of how it happened. So the other one is the scapegoat. And I put a few examples of what other people refer to as a scapegoat. But it's pretty much, these are all pretty much the same. The bad boy, the bad girl, the screw up, the rebel.
I like the truth sayer.
The truth sayer. So yes. So do you want to explain how that works? Because the rebel versus the truth sayer doesn't sound exactly the same. So what do you mean by that?
So the truth sayer, we've all met that little precocious kid that, my dad drinks a 6-pack every night. And the parents are like, shut up. And that poor child's probably going to get it that night. But, that's the truth sayer. That's that. It's usually a precocious child or an impulsive child or it could even be a rebel, especially a teenage rebel that's just tired of the nonsense. And these people are hypocrites. I'm going to expose them for what they are.
So the concept, going back to maybe the archetype of the scapegoat, is that the sins of the town are placed on the goat, and the goat is sent out of town. Do I get that right?
Sent out into the forest.
Into the forest.
Yeah, poor scapegoat.
Yeah. So the essence of it is, what you're saying is that the scapegoat is carrying all the sins of the family, but they're the ones that end up telling the truth or disclose the dysfunction within the family. Because there's family rules that say, thou shalt not speak of what's going on inside the family.
And this is often that kid that's acting out that, let's say the family shows up to a church function and they look so perfect and everybody's hair is perfect, their car is perfect, their lawn is perfect, their clothes are perfect. And then they've got the scapegoat over here who's got her hair all dyed black and she's very emo, I guess is what they call them nowadays. Sulking and
we used to call it the goth, right?
The goth, and
now let's call it emo.
And they're always known for being the one that's pot smoking or vaping nowadays, I guess, is doing drugs, that basically they're acting out the family dysfunction.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's I think that's the key, is they're acting out
the family dysfunction.
the
Now,
issues
I'm
in
not
the family.
going to be here and say every email child's family is dysfunctional, but this is the literature, the studies that have been done on family roles.
So this comes from it comes from the family literature, family systems theory. Okay, so and I remember one of the things that my parents were always pointing to, Rebel Without a Cause. Dean, what was his name? Dean. Oh gosh,
James Dean.
Yeah, Rebel Without a Cause, and that was a big thing back then.
The bad boy,
mm-hmm.
and they're usually that the dark
and sulking, and what is it?
Yeah, the brooding kind of character that girls are attracted to.
Yeah. So the bad boy. So they're looking for the scapegoat. Unfortunately, those kids are often in their teenage years, and sometimes even sooner, they're involved with risky behavior, including drugs, alcohol, and some of the other thing that's going on nowadays.
Yeah, and unfortunately, kids with things like ADHD, dyslexia,
they get scapegoated.
Oh yeah, very easily. Autism, they're easy scapegoats.
Yeah,
easy.
So they're treated like scapegoats, and that's the role they end up playing. Yeah. So now let's go over to the hero, because that was a big one for me, because I was the achiever, and I was also a mama's boy. So everything else, pretty much, you got the lost child, the scapegoat, and everything else falls under the hero category. That's what makes it really simple. It makes this particular model, the Pia Melody model, really simple and easy to grasp, especially for individuals that are trying to work through their marriage. So if you're not a lost child, you're not a scapegoat, you're a hero somewhere. And remember, it can fluctuate. You can play a different role with mom and a different role with dad.
And the hero can also be, you've got the clown.
Got the clown. Yeah. That's a big one. People always like the clown.
And our boys like to be clowns.
So somebody, an interesting in pop culture from our generation, the classic clown was Chandler from Friends.
Yeah.
And he came from a messed up family, right?
Yeah.
He was the one that had Phoebe was the worst. Remember, Phoebe was, both of her parents died and she was on the streets, if you remember.
Yeah.
But
lost child.
Right. So it's interesting. I still go back and watch that show over and over. But it was interesting. So much of the psychology was actually pretty spot on. But Chandler, if you remember, parents divorced very early on, and dad ran away to be a Vegas what were they called? Yeah, dad became a Vegas showgirl in one of those Vegas shows. And then mom was clearly what we used to call an nymphomaniac. So Chandler didn't stand a chance.
Or a cougar.
Right. She was a cougar. Yeah, that's right. Because she even kissed Ross. I can't believe I know so much about the show. But she kissed Ross in the bathroom while they were out to dinner, and then Chandler found out, and anyway. But that was a classic clown growing up, and that's why he used that not only to medicate, but just to appease everybody and have everybody calm during that time. But I had to be the achiever. I had to perform well in school. I went through a period, I think right after my parents got divorced, I went through a period where I was the scapegoat. I started misbehaving and acting out.
That's more rebellious.
Yeah, I started to rebel, and I even got kicked out of school. I was getting into fights at school. And then I ended up being placed in a military school. At the time, I hated it, but in retrospect, it really saved me. And I ended up doing really well when I was in school. I channeled a lot of that anger through sports. So that was my role. But there's also the mama's boy, where you essentially, I got here the confidant at the bottom, because when the mom uses one of the children, or the dad uses one of the children as their confidant, for example, if I take one of our kids and I start confiding in them how messed up you are or how you make my life miserable, that is really dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And that puts a lot of pressure on a child that they're not ready to handle. And they end up carrying that messed up relationship into their adult relationships.
Kind of insidious part of that is that as the adult is confiding in the child is fed this sort of narcissistic, I'm being confided in. So their ego is being falsely inflated at the same time.
Yeah, so it's falsely empowering.
Yeah.
So yes, it gives the child a sense of
superiority.
It's not based on any skill or anything. It's just on the parent using the child as a therapist, right? Yeah. So that's where that issue comes from. So I have a couple more there. There's the daddy's girl is the version of the mama's boy, but then the boy towards dad, that would be dad's buddy, mom's confidant. So there's a lot of them that you can find in the family systems literature. I just gave you a few examples here.
I've heard moms say that their daughter is their best friend.
Yeah. I mean, an adult daughter is fine, but a 12-year-old daughter being a mom's best friend, that's got to be very careful with that. And I know that happens a lot.
Especially these days.
Yes. So the children need to have friends their own age. And the parents can engage with activities.
The parents need to have friends their own
age, right? Yeah. And then it helps to have couples have
couples
friends.
Their own.
Yeah, they're couples friends, right? Yeah. But then they can share experiences with the kids. Taking them to Disney World is fine. For example, here's an example of dad's buddy is dad taking their 12-year-old son to a strip club.
Yeah.
That is clearly wrong. Then that's child abuse.
Yeah.
There are some more subtle situations like that. Like getting drunk with your child.
I heard.
That too.
Common.
Now, if you're gonna,
I still know somebody that
still does that. Yeah. Smokes weed
with her adult son. Yeah.
Yeah. Well. Okay, if they're both adults, it's one thing, but if they're doing it as adults, that means it probably started earlier.
Yeah,
it
started earlier. Yeah.
So that's not appropriate. So we use some extreme examples. Now you're probably people watching are probably thinking, well, that's not me. Well, think of more subtle situations, and make sure that you're looking at yourself, making sure that you're not engaging in something like that. That you didn't engage in something like that, and hopefully you're not engaging like that.
You're not getting fed by your partnership with your child. In other words, you're allowing your child enough space to have their own friends, have their own life, their own secret life. Even, you don't need to know everything about your teenage child.
Yeah, well, we don't want to get too much into that. Maybe we'll have a parenting episode that we can go over that. But yeah, I mean, we do need to know what our kids are up to.
You do need to know that. For instance, there's my older son told me about a classmate whose mother was there every morning cleaning out his locker and arranging it for him and following him to class. And
yeah, that's a helicopter parent.
Yeah.
So you're saying that,
intrusive, just being intrusive.
Right. So the kids need their own boundaries as well. And mom doesn't need to be walking into the kid's bathroom, into the boy's bathroom while he's taking a shower.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. Right.
That's what I mean by having their own secret life, their own inner life.
They need their privacy.
Yeah, exactly.
Excuse me. They need their privacy, but at the same time, parents need to know what the kids are up to. So there's a balance there.
Like internet. Of course, you want to monitor that. And
especially this day and age. They probably don't need a phone for quite a while.
Sex, drugs, that, of course.
That kind of stuff, yeah. So we'll touch on that when we do parenting episodes. But for the time being, we'll just leave it at that. Okay, so why are these things important? Because the attachment style is affected by these, and we're going to narrow this. There's the attachment styles are the healthy one is I'm drawing a blank. Secure attachment. So secure attachment is the healthy one, right? So then there's anxious and there's avoidant. Mm-hmm. Now I included here addicted attachment style because that comes from the addiction literature, mm-hmm. Addictive relationships, and there's not as much science behind it, but they still apply. And certainly with our experience is that's very, very indicative and gives us clarity and I just want to say that it adds a level of reality that we can understand. So how many people have been around who has a friend that keeps being attracted to the wrong kind of partner, man or woman? Certainly we had a friend that kept he kept getting into serious relationships with alcoholics, alcoholic women. And it's like he couldn't break that habit and ended up marrying one. Mm-hmm. So those things do matter. And that certainly sounds like an addiction as to that type of relationship. Mm-hmm. So the other one is avoidant, and there's some subsets, but we're going to leave it at those two. So the hero, if let's say you played a hero role as a child, let's say to mom, you were a mama's boy, then you're going to have an avoidant style towards women. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And I will say that certainly was me because I was a mama's boy, and then I tended to have more of an avoidant style.
Because you were smothered.
Right. Yeah. I was smothered, and being in a relationship, I felt suffocated, or at least that was my perception, that I felt suffocated. Mm-hmm. Right.
And I was a scapegoat.
So going back here, you're talking about dad scapegoated you. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, and just society in general, because I had ADHD undiagnosed.
Right. So yeah. I know, but we're talking about, so let's say how this works in a relationship. Mm-hmm. Going back, how this works in a relationship is your relationship to me is going to matter on how you related to your dad. Yeah. So what was your relationship with your dad in terms of those childhood roles, and what was my relationship to my mom? And by the way, looking at these, going back to the hero, scapegoat, and lost child, both of us played those three roles with each of our parents at different points in our childhood, right? So you had a scapegoat role with dad, right? Yeah. So that gives you an avoidant scenario, but it also gives you the anxious attachment as well.
I would agree with both of them. It depends on the situation.
Right. And then when your father died, that put you on lost child. So you would very strongly tilt towards anxious addicted when you are in a relationship with me that I'm mostly avoidant. So, and the way that works, so we haven't talked about exactly how that manifests in a relationship, but this is how we determine that. So with dad, lost child, scapegoat, that puts you both but tilting towards anxious attachment. And with me, it puts me under avoidant. Okay. And you mentioned suffocation, which it's exactly how it felt being a mama's boy. All that weight of trying to please my mother and being her confidant just was too much for I was as early as 6-7 years old when that was going on. So all the way through my teenage years.
And so for a scapegoat, eventually, so, of course, anxious, addicted, food was my medicine. That's how I would start out. But eventually it became too overwhelming, and I'd have to. So for my dad, I would just kind of sneak away and go hide somewhere. As far as in our relationship, I'll go on vacation
or go shopping.
Yes, just to get away.
So I think what Jennifer's getting at is when we're looking at what happens with those attachments, and there's good research supporting the role of attachment styles with addictive behaviors. Right? That's real solid research there. So one of the things that happened with me is that this was in the early era of video porn. Exposure to adult videos. We're going to use the word corn. If you're not familiar with internet issues, we don't want to say the other word. But I was exposed to that at a very early age. And so that was a way to medicate. That continued up until later on, and that was a problem for me, even through our relationship. And you were medicating, you mentioned food. Okay, that's a real easy way to medicate.
Oh, yeah.
Especially with,
Especially nowadays, nobody notices.
But growing up, there was we didn't know all the issues with the sugar stuff, right? With
corn syrup and all that, stuff that's addictive.
The Fun Dip and gummy bears and all that. And that was a real easy way to medicate.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what she's getting at here is when we are dealing with these attachment styles, we medicate. We have to find ways to medicate ourselves. At the same time, what does the attachment refer to? So the avoidant attachment means that I'm trying to avoid intimacy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then let me go back to this. So the avoidant situation, you're avoiding intimacy, and the anxious attachment means you're anxious about separation. Mm-hmm. So essentially, in colloquial terms, is separation anxiety, while the other one is fear of intimacy. Okay. And this is actually there's quite solid neurobiology behind this. So the avoidant avoids intimacy by escaping the relationship, and the anxious, while the avoidant tries to exit. And by exit, I mean, I just find ways to
leave,
to not be intimate, not necessarily depart the relationship, although sometimes it manifests into that. Yes, emotionally.
Like even walling off, stonewalling.
Or medicating, watching television instead of sitting down and talking.
Yeah.
So part of what we're doing here with this podcast is forcing us to actually sit down and talk. Not that we need to be forced to, but it's a good way to channel a lot of this. Poor Trinity, she's barely staying awake. So the anxious attachment with the other person separates, then they feel anxious and they try to bring the person back into the relationship.
Through all kinds of
right. And that's
dysfunctional
the so-called love bombs.
Mm-hmm.
That's what now a lot of people nowadays, especially the younger generation, uses the love bomb differently. But what originally the love bomb in recovery circles meant is that you cause some kind of drama to try to bring the other person back into a relationship. One extreme example that you see, especially in movies, an attempt at a suicide gesture. Yeah. So taking in a bunch of pills, and then the other person needs to come and rescue her, or him for that matter. Mm-hmm. Those are extreme examples.
Feigning sickness.
Yes. So, and sometimes people get physically ill. They're not necessarily feigning the illness. It's just they get physically ill, and the other person has to come back to their relationship. But another thing that happens is this tension that occurs in relationships can manifest themselves in the bedroom. Difficulty with sexual performance. So literal intimacy, physical intimacy becomes difficult in couples that way. And that's why a lot of when people seek therapy for that, the first thing that they have to do, there's an old saying, the largest sex organ is the brain. Because you have to reestablish that intimacy first before all these other issues get worked out, right? Mm-hmm. Sexual issues or issues in the bedroom. Issues in the bedroom get sorted out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and there's a number of workbooks out there that help with intimacy. The one that we used in our groups,
Imago.
The Imago is actually really good, and IMAGO, and people can use it. It is Christian based, so if you're not Christian, I think there are some others that are similar. John Gottman, the Gottman Institute has some intimacy exercises as well that couples can get, and they can get the book and work on it together.
And he's one of the top researchers
he is the top researcher
of marriage.
They can tell within minutes.
Seconds even.
Yeah, whether observing a couple, whether they're going to be divorced within 5 years. Yeah. I think we were on that list. Yeah. We were on that list there, yes. But we managed to.
Yeah, there's always hope.
Yeah.
There's always miracles.
Right. So anyway, the intimacy is what is the challenge. And sometimes because of all this that we talked about, all these attachment issues, sometimes people need to work on that individually. We have a lot of personal issues, we have to work them out if we want our marriage to survive. And for us, for the two of us, we actually had we had an individual therapist. So she had her therapist, I had mine, and then we had a couples therapist. And we worked through that at different rates. So we were really committed to making this work.
Yeah.
And it took quite a bit of time.
And it still takes time.
It does. We just had to do a touch up or a refresher with our therapist, because actually doing this podcast brought up some issues for us that we were running into some, essentially things just surface up, and we had to go back and refresh and go over things and just make sure that we're back on track.
Basically, whenever you have a major life change, like we both retired our medical spa and sold everything off, our employees all went to other lives, and our lives completely changed. And so our routine had completely changed. And so we had to relearn and renegotiate. How do we navigate this new life that we have? And I think that's always, it's so cliche, in the circles that we are in. People will spend years in therapy, digging deep, working hard, and then walk away, and 10 years later be back in the same, old routines, old dysfunctions, and say to their therapist, well, I thought I already worked through all this. And well, no, it took a lifetime to become the person that you were. So it will take a lifetime it
takes a while.
It's always going to be there. It's always going to, when we fully retire, it's probably going to come up again. Just know that you're not fixed, ever fixed. It's a process. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah. John Bradshaw had made a comment in one of his lectures about, it pissed him off that he had to spend the rest of his life figuring out what he should have learned by the time he was 8 years old and didn't learn it. So that's kind of where we're at. You grow up in a situation like we did, and you're going to spend the rest of your life working on it. It doesn't mean you're going to be fixed or you have to spend your whole time in therapy, but things are going to come up, and it helps to have other couples that work with you in that regard. So that's why the recovery circles are important. Be working with other couples that are interested in, just like with alcoholism, you don't stop being an alcoholic. That's why they say that. Even though you're sober, you can relapse at any time. And that's important, that people stay with with that in mind, with that recovery mentality or mindset, I should say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about the boundary differences between, say, the lost child and how they handle boundaries?
So there are issues that come up, and I don't have a chart for this. Let's go back and look at them. So if you can see, the hero child will end up building walls because they're so suffocated, and there's so much interaction with a dysfunctional parent. So the way that a hero child, and this becomes kind of obvious, and once you think about it, is they're going to try to be walled off and invulnerable. So essentially, they're going to have their armor up, and it's going to be solid.
And they can often be one up.
They can be one up, and
personality disorders would be like narcissism and things of that nature.
Yeah, there can be that. I prefer not to get into that.
Yeah.
But there can be an overlap with that situation. But the other two, for example, the lost child, let's go back to the lost child. You can see that there is no parent present. They're going to be neglected. So they're not going to learn how to set boundaries. So they're going to be boundary-less.
Yeah.
But they're also going to have walls when somebody comes in at them too quickly. Let's say they end up in a relationship and that other person is overwhelming to them, then they're going to put up walls, but the rest of the time they're going to be essentially boundaryless.
Yeah.
And they're going to be wanting attention, they're going to crave that attention. And then when they get it, they're not going to want it. That's how that works.
Exactly. It seems that the lost child's very complicated.
It is.
It says they have problems with moderation, being out of control, manipulative of others, yielding and enabling, passive aggressive, appearing powerless.
So in going back to the scapegoat, their boundaries are going to be very similar to the hero child. They're going to be walled off and invulnerable. And they're going to be often aggressive. Okay.
That would be different than the hero, right? The scapegoat, I mean, being the rebel is aggressive, right?
Right, right. Although the hero can be aggressive too if you push them enough. But they're often going to be good and perfect. They're going to try to be good and perfect because that's how they behave. But remember, roles change throughout life. Let's say the classic family systems, the oldest is the hero child and often becomes parent to the other children.
But not always.
Not always. Yeah. The middle child tends to be the lost child and the young one the scapegoat. That's a classic pattern, but that's really not always the case. Yeah. It just varies on the situation. One thing that can result, unfortunately, this is a very sad situation, that notice that under hero I have the caretaker. Yeah. If a parent gets sick, gets chronically ill.
Yeah. I mean, in some cases there's almost no.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very sad situation.
But even, I've seen children caretake their, alcoholic parent or their parent that just seems kind of out of control or helpless. And the kid's like, oh, well, I guess I'm the one that has to cook for everybody and I have to be the one to clean the house. And
right. And that becomes a problem because the caretaker, pretty much the hero child, doesn't think there's anything wrong.
Yeah. And I've heard a lot of them say, oh, I enjoyed watching all my siblings and
all 10 of them.
I was so good at it. And they get a lot of gratification because even as an older adult, they still get that kind of pedestal like position with all the siblings. They all come and, well, what should we do, Sandy? How should we behave? What choices?
You're not talking about a real Sandy. You just made that term up.
I'm just making that term up. But yeah, I mean, I've seen those hero children where they just thrive in that situation, or they feel like they're thriving in that situation where, they're giving financial advice, which house to buy, how to parent their children, it can kind of really build your ego in the wrong way.
Right. And often, in some cases, they are functional. Yeah. But the issues are going to come out sideways and affect the relationship. Yeah. So one thing that people say, because you're describing a form of narcissism. Now, I didn't want to get into this, but now since you brought it up, so there is a narcissistic, and I don't mean this narcissistic disorder per se, but there's some narcissism involved there, and the people that suffer from it are the people around them. Yeah. So I've seen this where they feel like they got everything's under control. They got it all taken care of. Nothing's missing from their house, their finances, nothing. But there's no intimacy. Yeah. And they have a hard time admitting that. And it's always the other person's issue.
Other people are the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've seen some of this where, well, my kids don't talk to me. That's really sad. Yeah.
You see a lot of that with elderly people.
Yes, unfortunately, that happens quite a bit. And some people just don't want to deal with it. And that's fine. That's their choice. But how do we get around that in terms of a relationship? But it helps to have, again, we keep talking about having other couples and it's what we call accountability in recovery.
So that you're not in an echo chamber.
Right. You can hear yourself, you're beautiful. And then you just keep hearing that over and over, right?
But another couple, if you're acting out of control, the other couple, especially if you're out in, let's say we're at a football game and there are other parents around and one of the parents is out of control, we're not going to go point at them and say, hey, you need to contain it. We're just not going to hang around that person. But if you're in a couples group where you are
an accountability group,
an accountability group where you're accountable to each other, you will have your sponsor or your coach sit down with you and say, hey, I just wanted to have a conversation with you about the way I saw you were treating Janet, and is now a good time to talk about that. And so, it's done with boundaries and in a non-shaming way, but they're going to hold you accountable. You're not going to get away with, the husband's treating Janet disrespectfully or in front of everybody or being boundaryless in some way, shape, or form, if that makes sense.
And the groups tend to be very powerful. There are some studies on rationality that look at performance on tasks. And I'm just going to use this as a sidetrack. But when people are having trouble performing certain problem-solving tasks, they do better when they're talking to other people about that task. It doesn't help when there's yelling. Like politics makes that situation worse. But when you're talking to people trying to problem solve, that is very, very helpful in finding solutions to problems. And that's kind of what we're talking about. I mean, the 12-step people figured it out a long time ago, that you come, you share your issues with the group, and then the group can provide you with some guidance. And they will tell you if you're
out of control.
Yeah, it's like, I'm going to do the Sam Malone thing and buy a bar, and I'm an alcoholic, but I can handle not drinking. They'll tell you, that's really not a good idea. That's not what you need to be doing.
Yeah.
So the group helps, especially for other couples that need to be in recovery. So one question probably people are having is, where do I find these groups? We mentioned RCA, Recovering Couples Anonymous. What are other... The other thing is that you have to be comfortable in the group that you're going to.
Yeah.
So,
well, and especially smaller rural towns, you're not always going to find, you may find them online, and that's another great way to join. I think for years we started out with an online group because, believe it or not, our town was once a small town and there just wasn't a lot of resources. The other thing you can do are Celebrate Recovery is a 12-step group, but it's more... Christian-based. Christ-centered. Join a Bible study, sometimes you
couples Bible studies.
Yeah, couples Bible study. If you're in a larger town, there's probably a lot more going on, especially in therapy circles like the Imago therapy. Forget what was his name, the husband and wife that ran Imago therapy.
I don't remember. I know there are some resources that you can find on the Gottman Institute.
Yeah. There will be groups of meetup groups.
Yeah, so there's marriage support groups.
Yeah, different marriage support groups. And depending on your issues, maybe you have issues around finance. There might be a group that, supports each other through that and shares with each other how to have better communication around finance and find a solution for how you can share your finances in a functional way. Or, we've talked about addiction. There's plenty of those, but people have other issues besides just addiction. It may be communication, which we talked about the Imago therapy, but there's other dialoguing type couples groups. We did an expressive arts retreat once.
Yes, yeah. I don't know that there's official groups for that, but
there are.
Expressive arts for couples?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So if you have a therapist, they might be able to guide you on that. They might have resources themselves in their office that they can provide as well. Well, online groups are helpful. I'm not sure that they fit the bill when we're dealing with this kind of stuff.
It's
in
not
person,
as intimate. It's a start especially if you're kind of shy about going out and meeting people. And that was the other thing too, is we were worried about, we're very private people, and it took us, that was our baby step to get out and meet other people also.
Okay, so you mentioned we need to start wrapping this up. You mentioned finances, and that is going to be a future topic on how to handle finances as a couple, because that's a big source of discord with families. I mean, with couples.
One of the top reasons for divorce.
Yeah, it is. People say irreconcilable differences is the type one, which means I just don't want to be in the relationship.
Yeah.
And that is very sad. But yes, the money is a big source of that lack of reconciliation. Maybe, I don't know, I was just thinking maybe divorce lawyers have some resources for couples, but maybe that's not right.
Well, Diego's boss had resources. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's wrap this up. Was there any other comments you wanted to make about family of origin? We talked about how to process it, how this affects. We mostly talked about how this affects relationships. We didn't exactly talk about how to fix this.
Yeah.
That's a loaded question. And if you really have a lot of this underlying issues with attachment, then perhaps you do need to see a therapist about that.
But it gives you a kind of I hate to say diagnosis. It gives you an archetype to kind of hold on to and say, this is, I was a lost child, so this is how I'm going to attach to people around me. So this is why I'm so this way, or why I need someone with me all the time, or this is why I run away from relationships. So it gives you, now it's actually it can be a lot more complicated, but it gives you kind of an idea of why you either run from relationships or you really need that relationship, if that makes sense.
Yes. So it gives you a roadmap, or at least some guideposts. So I'm just going to put this up here again. Figure out what your childhood role and how you're getting into that attachment style.
Take a screenshot.
Yeah, take a screenshot of that. And again, this is overly simplistic. I don't know that.
Very, very simplistic. Yeah.
I wouldn't say very, very simplistic. I think it's a heuristic. If you get too much into the weeds, whether you had what type of anxious attachment style you had, then it might just confuse you. You're just trying to figure out, why am I running away from the relationship, or am I just craving that intimacy and I don't know how to get it?
Yeah.
All those situations might have an explanation, and if you want to pursue it further, you can. But the main thing is that couples start realizing that ultimately what we all want is that intimacy. We can't find it if we're playing this game of moving away, avoiding, and trying to bring the other person into the relationship.
And smothering, yeah.
Smothering, yes, because that is how it feels for a hero child, and for a scapegoat and a lost child does feel like abandonment.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Do you have any comments on what were we going to discuss next? I think we were talking about doing an episode on shame, only talking about shame and spirituality.
Let's see. Shame is in there somewhere, but see if I can find it.
The last chapter that we talked about emotional reality, we just touched on shame a little bit, but shame's a very, very deep topic, and I think it's important to address it because is the source of our spiritual. I don't want to say the source of all spirituality, but humility comes from shame. And if we think we're godlike, then we're not going to be spiritual.
Yeah.
And that's why shame is so important.
Yeah.
So what were you going to?
So yeah, it's shame. And so if we think we're godlike, we're shameless, right?
Pretty much. Shamelessness is, it's it is. We keep saying the N word, narcissism, but yeah, shamelessness is believing that you're God and you're the source of whatever it is you need. Usually, when we're shameless, we're trying to fill up that God-sized hole in there. We're only gonna fill it through humility. If you have any questions or comments, please submit them. And suggestions for topics are trying to keep it. I was going to say we're trying to keep it light, but this was not exactly a very light. But we'll try to keep it a little bit lighter as the show goes on. But relationships are hard.
Yeah,
Relationships are not easy. If they were easy, we wouldn't have to work at them. When people say, I think we've said this in one other episode, the goal of marriage is not happiness. People say, I want to have a happy marriage. Happiness hopefully will come, and it'll come in brief spurts, but the goal is growth, right? And then providing, it's a life source for your family.
I've seen people that, run from relationship to relationship and they never change. There's still that same person that I met 20, 30 years ago. But the people that have stuck with that person, they had to change. They had no other choice but to change. And more often than not, it's changed for the better.
And they both changed.
Yeah.
Because they both grew.
Yes. Especially, when you see a person that you knew 20 years ago that was angry and now that anger is tempered, and that person that you knew 20, 30 years ago that was anxious and tightly wound and now they're laid back and chill. And, it's those kind of things that, you have to work at in a relationship to be able for that relationship to survive. Or somebody that was very withdrawn or introverted, be more adventurous. When we work together and stick together, we have to grow in those ways.
Trinity's more awake now. I guess she's feeling better. So what's Trinity wearing? We left out the segment.
She's wearing her little hoodie because she's under the weather.
At some point, these outfits have to be some kind of animal abuse.
No, she loves it. She keeps her warm.
Okay, well, don't forget to like and share and subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
All right. Bye-bye.